After discovering that the baby's father was poor, a father kicks his pregnant daughter out of the house. But something happens that makes him deeply regret it. Stephanie had always been a quiet, sensitive, and resilient young woman. Since she was little, she learned to hide what she felt and behave as was expected of her. She grew up in a home where affection was scarce and silence prevailed. She was the only child of Gregory, a stern man who owned a small chain of stores and was obsessed with his own reputation. For him, honor was everything, and the family's image came before anything else. Nothing was discussed, only followed. Susan, her mother, was submissive and silent. She never confronted Gregory, only tried to keep the peace without causing conflicts. Within that strict environment, Stephanie was raised with a clear goal: to be a symbol of prestige. From an early age, she learned that her value lay in obedience, appearance, and how well she fit socially. There was even talk of a marriage with Richard, the son of one of her father's business partners. To Gregory, Richard was the ideal match, a successful young man from an influential family, and Stephanie, without being consulted, was being shaped to fulfill that role. But gradually, Stephanie began to realize there was a part of herself that didn't fit into that rigid mold her father tried to maintain. It was a lighter, quieter part, yet full of questions. She couldn't name it, but she felt it. There was another version of herself that wanted to breathe outside that theater of appearances. And that version only appeared when she wasn't being judged, when she didn't have to please anyone. It was in that hidden space that John appeared. He was the gardener who came by occasionally to take care of the houseplants. He wasn't a full-time employee, only came when called, usually after heavy rain or during pruning months. Gregory barely noticed him. Susan always referred to him simply as the tool guy. But Stephanie paid attention. John was different. He had a sincere calmness in the way he moved through the garden. He worked silently, patiently, almost lovingly with the plants. His eyes, when they met hers by chance, were not invasive. They were attentive. They listened, even without words. One afternoon, Stephanie was sitting on the bench near the rose bushes, reading a poetry book she had secretly taken from her mother's closet. Gregory didn't like her reading useless things. John approached slowly, cleaning his hoe with an old rag. "That one good?" John asked, nodding his chin toward the book. Stephanie hesitated for a second. Then she nodded. "Yes, it is. But it's sad," Stephanie said, still looking at the page. John sat down on the ground nearby, but not too close. "Some things only make sense when they hurt a little," he said without irony. Stephanie looked at him again, longer this time. She didn't answer. But there, unknowingly, she allowed a crack to open. The following days were filled with small exchanges, discreet glances, quick comments. One day, she left a book on the bench and went away for a few minutes. When she came back, the book was still there, but with a flower pressed between the pages. "Did you put this here?" Stephanie asked next time she saw him. John smiled slightly. "I thought it was pretty. I thought it matched the poem you were reading yesterday." She didn't know what to say. She just held the book more carefully, as if it had gained weight. Their conversations continued. Sometimes they lasted minutes. Other times, just a nod and a discreet smile. But something was growing. There were no declared intentions, no plans. There was space. And for Stephanie, that was new. Over time, John started bringing old books he had gotten or found at cheap stalls. He left them in a corner of the garden in a bag. Stephanie found them and read them all. Then they talked quietly about them, always careful not to let anyone overhear. "You read very fast," John said one day. "That's because I never had anyone to talk to about what I read. Now I do," Stephanie replied, looking him in the eyes for the first time without looking away. Their exchanges became more intimate. There were no promises, only presence. One day, when Gregory was away at a business meeting and Susan was busy organizing closets in the back of the house, Stephanie invited John for an impromptu tea in the back garden. They used old mugs and dry bread with butter. "This is too fancy for me," John said, smiling without irony. "Me too," Stephanie said, and they laughed. It was that day he touched her hand for the first time, for a few seconds, and she didn't pull away. Their relationship didn't develop quickly. Stephanie was afraid of betraying something, afraid of herself, afraid of her father. But there was a place inside her that, with John, finally seemed to breathe. He demanded nothing, just listened. He was there. Months of quick, hidden meetings passed, always careful. Gregory's house was a prison of appearances. Every step was watched, every gesture judged. But in the garden, among the scents of wet earth and trimmed leaves, Stephanie found freedom. Until one day, the delay came. At first, she thought it was stress. Then came the nausea, the dizziness, the strange feeling in her body. She bought a test secretly, used it locked in the bathroom. When she saw the result, she sat on the floor and stayed there for long minutes. That day, she didn't talk to anyone, hid everything. But the weight grew. She couldn't eat properly. Sleeping was impossible. Finally, she decided to tell John. They met behind the greenhouse as always. "I need to tell you something," Stephanie said, her voice faltering. John looked at her seriously. "Go ahead." I'm pregnant." He took a few seconds to process, ran his hand over his face, took a deep breath. "Are you sure?" John asked. "I am. I took the test twice," she said, unable to hide the fear in her eyes. John approached slowly, carefully. "You're not alone, do you hear me?" he said firmly. "I'm here," Stephanie cried, not from despair, but relief. The next day, Stephanie woke up with her heart racing. She had barely slept the night before, rehearsing in her mind what she would say, trying to predict every possible reaction from her father. But no mental rehearsal could truly prepare her body for what was coming. The fear was not about the future. It was about the exact moment when the truth would break the silence her family lived in. She went down the stairs with measured steps and headed to her father's office. The door was ajar, and Gregory was inside, as always, leaning over the desk, reviewing spreadsheets and papers with his usual stern expression. She knocked lightly on the door. "Dad." "May I speak with you for a moment?" Stephanie said, her voice firmer than she expected. Gregory didn't look away from the documents. Several seconds passed before he answered. "Make it quick. I'm handling something important." Stephanie took a deep breath. Her hands trembled, but she kept her arms steady at her sides. "I'm pregnant," she said bluntly. Gregory's pen stopped on the paper. He slowly raised his eyes, first confused, then rigid, as if hearing something unreal. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low and cold. "I'm pregnant, Dad," Stephanie repeated. "I found out a few days ago." He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and kept his eyes fixed on her, as if waiting for an explanation. The silence lasted longer than she could bear. "Whose?" Gregory asked, each word spat out like a blade. Stephanie took a second. She thought about lying, about inventing something less offensive to his pride, but she wasn't going to do that. She was tired of lying for convenience. "John's, the gardener," she said, her voice shaky but steady without looking away. The silence that followed was dense, suffocating. Gregory uncrossed his arms slowly, stood up calmly, and walked to the window, his back to her. He stood there, looking at the backyard, the same backyard where John had so often cleaned leaves, pruned bushes, watered flowers. "Do you realize what you've done?" he said without turning his face. I fell in love with him. He always treated me with respect. He listened to me. I didn't plan this, but I won't hide it. Gregory turned slowly, his face red with restrained anger. You threw away everything we built. Our family name. Why? For a gardener, a nobody without a steady job? He's more of a man than anyone I've ever met, Stephanie said, her voice now firm despite tears in her eyes. He was by my side when no one else was. You're saying that now, but soon you'll be begging to come back, after he leaves you like all the others useless ones do, and I won't be here to take you back. He won't leave me, Stephanie said. I don't care. Pack your things. You're leaving this house today, before anyone else finds out about this shame. Stephanie froze. She wanted to believe he wasn't serious. She wanted room for dialogue, but his look was non-negotiable. It was the same as always, the look that erased. Dad, I have nowhere to go, she said, feeling her body start to weaken. You made your choice. Now deal with the consequences. And don't call me Dad. From today, you're no longer my daughter, Gregory said coldly. At that moment, Susan appeared in the hallway. Her hands were still wet. She had come from the kitchen. Her eyes moved from Gregory to Stephanie and understood everything in seconds. Gregory, please, Susan said in a faint voice. She's our daughter. We need to talk. Stay out of this, Susan, Gregory said without raising his voice, but with a firmness that cut. Susan hesitated, then stepped back, lowered her head, and said nothing more. Stephanie looked at her mother with desperate eyes, hoping for any gesture, but Susan just looked away, as she always had. The young woman went upstairs slowly. She grabbed a backpack, threw in some clothes, a toothbrush, documents. She didn't know how long she'd be gone, maybe one day, maybe forever. When she came down, Susan was still in the same position, leaning against the wall, unable to face her daughter. You could have said something, Stephanie said without anger, just sadness. Susan remained silent. Stephanie left through the front door, alone. No money, no support, not even the comfort of a hug. Instead of wandering aimlessly, she went straight to Deborah's house, an old school friend she hadn't spoken to in a long time but still trusted. She knocked, not knowing how she'd be received. When Deborah opened and saw her there, with watery eyes and a worn face, she didn't hesitate. Come in, for God's sake, Deborah said, pulling her inside. Stephanie broke down. I have nowhere to go, she said, crying. They sat on the small living room couch, and Stephanie told everything. About John, about the pregnancy, about the confrontation with her father, and about leaving home with nothing but the backpack on her back. Deborah listened quietly, without interrupting. When Stephanie finished, she held her hand firmly. Stay here. It's not big, but there's an extra mattress, and you're not alone, Deborah said. That same night, John sent a message. He was worried about her silence during the day and wanted to know how the talk with her father had gone. She replied shortly after, with trembling fingers and still red eyes. She told him she had been kicked out, left with only a backpack, no money, no support, and that Deborah had taken her in. John didn't hesitate, asked for the address, said he would come over, and less than an hour later, knocked on the door. His face was tired, eyes squinted, still wearing his work uniform. You okay? He asked as soon as she opened. Now I am, Stephanie said, and hugged him tightly. The next day, John quit his night shift. The money he made barely supported his sick mother, but still, he gathered what little he had and went to live with Stephanie in Deborah's spare room. They slept together on a mattress on the floor, shared simple meals, and faced the future with what little they had. John didn't complain, carried bags, accompanied Stephanie to appointments, listened to her worries. He was with her through every pain and every absence. You didn't have to be here, she said one night, looking at the ceiling. I know, but I want to be, he replied. It was through Kevin, their former teacher, that a chance arose. Upon running into Stephanie on the street, he recognized her, and after hearing the whole story, made a call. My sister is living alone now. Maybe she has a free room, Kevin said. And she did. Kevin's sister listened carefully to everything the teacher told her about Stephanie and John. She didn't hesitate, said the room was available and they could stay as long as they needed, even without money. It was a modest space at the back of the house, but clean, with a window that let in the morning sun. In return, Stephanie began helping with the house chores, cleaning, cooking, keeping everything in order. John, in turn, quickly found work as an assistant in a nearby hardware store. The salary was low, but enough to cover basics and part of the rent. Over time, they created a routine. Meals were simple, nights short, weekends busy with errands, health clinic visits, and tight budgeting. Still, there was relief. There was a bed, a roof, and partnership. Months later, the baby was born. It was in a public hospital after hours of waiting on a cold early morning. John stayed by Stephanie's side the whole time. The boy was born small, fragile, and needed to spend a few days in intensive care. They took turns visiting, enduring uncomfortable nights in the waiting room, dozing on hard chairs, eating bread with lukewarm coffee from the machine. They were tired, worried, but never alone. No relatives came, no phone calls. Just the two of them, hand in hand, facing everything together. When the baby was finally discharged, they chose the name together. They didn't use any name from her family or his. They wanted something new, representing a fresh start, a name just for them. During the recovery period, Stephanie was still weak. John took over everything, worked during the day, did the shopping, took care of the food, changed diapers, bathed the baby, and still found time to sit by her side at night with a cup of hot tea. "You should rest more," he said, handing her the tea. "And you should sleep more than 2 hours a night," she replied with a half smile. "But you need me. That's enough for me," John said without hesitation. When Stephanie said she wanted to go back to school, John just nodded. "If that's what you want, we'll make it happen." He rearranged his work schedule, did the math, cut expenses, paid part of the course with his tight salary. And when money ran short, they had an idea. They started making homemade sweets at night. They rolled brigadeiros and carefully wrapped them, and John went out selling them on the streets and at college exits. Nothing was easy, but everything was done with effort and complicity. Every difficulty overcome was proof that they were together by choice and courage. Time passed, but for Gregory the world began to crumble from the inside out. He no longer walked the streets with the same air of superiority as before. The reputation he had cultivated for years, built on rigidity, deals sealed with a handshake, and loyalty demanded, started to fall apart as rumors began to spread. First whispers, then formal accusations. Richard, the young man who for so long had been presented as the ideal son-in-law, the symbol of perfect alliance between families, involved him in a fraudulent contract scheme. Gregory, blinded by trust and desire to keep power, signed documents without question. When everything came to light, it was too late. He lost properties, stores, partners. The partners who had once competed for space by his side began to distance themselves, ashamed and afraid of being dragged into the same mud. Gregory found himself alone, feeling for the first time the real weight of what he had built. A wall of control that, when it fell, left no one to support him. Susan was the first to leave, not with fights or shouting. She just packed her bags and quietly said goodbye, the same way she had spent her life avoiding conflict. "I'm not staying here anymore," Susan said, sitting on the edge of the bed, hands on her lap. "I spent my life in silence. Now I just want to live the rest of it in peace." Gregory didn't answer. He just looked at her for a few seconds, then turned his face away. Deep down, he knew nothing held her there anymore. After that, the house felt too big for his loneliness. He spent his days wandering from room to room, reviewing old papers, trying to understand exactly where he had lost his way. Over time, memories of Stephanie began to return, first with anger, That dull anger that made him mutter to himself, then discomfort, and then something he resisted naming, longing. One day, with little else to do, Gregory was fiddling with his cell phone and ended up opening the contacts list. Seeing Deborah's name, an old friend of Stephanie's, he remembered she had always been close to his daughter. On impulse, he clicked the profile. He scrolled through some photos without paying much attention until one image made him stop. It was Stephanie, holding a baby in her arms, standing next to John. They were both smiling. It was a simple photo, no luxury, no staged backdrop. But there was something there he couldn't look away from. Peace. Gregory's chest tightened. He stared at the image for long minutes, trying to find a reason for why it hurt so much. For the first time, he didn't feel anger. He felt emptiness. The next day, Gregory searched through old contacts on his phone and found Deborah's number still saved. Years ago, she had organized a birthday party for Stephanie, and he needed her number to sort out details. He called. Her voice was rougher than he remembered. "It's me, Gregory. Sorry to bother you," he said hesitantly. "Gregory?" Deborah sounded surprised. There was a short silence before she answered. "Gregory, Stephanie's dad, is that you? I want to know if you can help me see my daughter," he said bluntly. Deborah didn't answer right away. He waited, hearing the wind on the other side of the line. "I can't promise anything, but I'll talk to her," Deborah said before hanging up. Days later, he got the answer. Stephanie would agree to see him. Once. No guarantees, no promises, just a conversation. Gregory dressed as best as he could, put on the least wrinkled shirt, fixed his hair, and went to the address Deborah had given him. His heart felt heavier than his legs. When he arrived, John opened the door. He said nothing, just looked firmly, not aggressively, but without any sign of welcome. "She's in there," John said before stepping aside. Stephanie was sitting on the couch, her son playing with a toy car on the carpet. When Gregory entered, she stood up. She didn't hug him, didn't smile, just maintained a straight, polite but distant posture. "You can sit," Stephanie said. "Thank you," Gregory said, pulling out a chair cautiously. There was an awkward silence. He looked around, trying to absorb this new world. It was simple, but alive. There were photos on the walls, toys on the floor, a plant on the windowsill. "I wanted to say that," he started, then stopped. His voice faltered, tried again. "I wanted to see you, to know how you are." "I'm fine," Stephanie said firmly. "I saw a photo. You looked happy." "We are?" she replied, looking at her son. John came into the room with a bottle of water, set it on the table, and stood leaning against the wall. He was watching. Gregory noticed the gesture. He understood. "I was wrong about you," Gregory said. "Both of you." Stephanie just nodded. After a few seconds, she said, "We're not here to reopen wounds, but to see if it's possible to move forward without carrying so much weight." Gregory lowered his eyes. There was no immediate forgiveness there, but a door slightly ajar. From that day on, Gregory began visiting the house from time to time, never without warning. He brought bags of fruit, clothes for the grandson, cheap toys, sometimes even medicine. He left everything on the kitchen table and left silently, never demanded a place, never asked for anything. "You don't have to bring things every time," Stephanie said once. "I know, but it's what I can do for now," Gregory replied. Over time, he stayed a little longer. Sometimes he sat in the backyard with his grandson, helped John care for the plants, didn't say much, just did. Stephanie set boundaries from the start, and John respected and made sure they were respected. Gregory never crossed the lines. He knew his time there was borrowed, earned with effort. Years passed. Stephanie completed her education and got a stable job as a school counselor. With patience, Discipline and John's help, they bought a modest but stable house. It was theirs. No one could take it away. John started his own garden maintenance and landscaping business. He started small, with few tools, lots of work, and 2 trusted colleagues he met in past jobs. He managed the work with the same care he gave his family. They got married legally, without a party, only with the closest witnesses. Deborah and Kevin were among them. It was a simple but genuine ceremony, an ordinary day with full meaning. Susan, now in fragile health, reappeared a year later. Stephanie received her cautiously. They talked, cried, reconnected with small gestures. Susan began living in an annex in the back of the house, where she cared for her grandson and watched life unfold with the delicacy she never had the strength to practice before. Gregory, now old and sick, asked to stay too. He didn't ask for shelter. He asked for a corner. Stephanie hesitated, but agreed. He began living on the same property in another back room. He wasn't part of the main routine, but he was there, planting, cleaning, teaching his grandson to handle seeds and tools. He wrote a lot in notebooks no one read. It was his way of not disappearing. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he also didn't run away. He understood that his role now was to repair, even if silently. Years later, at the grandson's school, there was an annual fair. Each child presented a project about something important in their lives. When it was his turn, he went up to the small stage with a colorful poster and a phrase at the top, "My grandfather's second chance." He began speaking without shyness. My grandfather made mistakes, but then he tried to fix them. He didn't talk much, but he did things. He taught me how to plant and take care, and now we get along. Love, even when it comes late, can still grow. Stephanie listened with full eyes. She was sitting next to John, who held her hand firmly. She wasn't crying from pain. She cried for everything that was lost and for everything they managed to rebuild. There, in that moment, she understood that some stories don't have to be perfect to make sense. They just have to be true. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.